He did 3 IPOs. And one of the things he told me back then that I've never forgotten is he said the secret to his career was that he just always figured out where the engine room was in the business or the organization he worked at. And he wanted to be as close to the engine room.
It's a lot of survivorship bias, right? I think very few, and the conversion rate on like how many people actually make money on YouTube is actually ridiculous. I think it's more unequal than the real life.
There are kind of 3 main groups that I think are relevant right now. There's the legacy traditional media folks like a Forbes, the New York Times, or others. There's the new media like me, like Eric Newcomer, Alex Heath, that whole sort of Substack or Beehive ecosystem, and also journalists who do podcasts and shows. And then I think there's the really good sort of non-journalistic content creators. And that could be, TBPN, it could be some of these VC-led podcasts or your podcast. I ran the Midas List for 10 years, so I obviously wouldn't have done that if I thought it was like a worthless project. But we did work hard to like make it better while I was working on it. And I think number one is it was 100% meant to be quantitative as much as possible. We also wouldn't remove someone just because they said they didn't like Forbes, they didn't like Midas.
Yeah, I would probably stop the podcast because I don't have enough bandwidth to do all the stuff necessary to get the podcast out, even though like I have some editor working on it, but I still have to do a bunch of work before and after the process. And what I've learned is like there are air tools. I can see it happening soon where I don't have to spend so much time.
My guest today is Alex. Alex is the founder and editor of Upstart Media, a new tech publication focused on the startup ecosystem. He was previously at Forbes for almost a decade and was a senior editor at Forbes covering startups and venture capital. I think media today, across segments, whether it's comedy, politics, startups, is sort of like moving into this decentralized long tail where, there were fused, big old tech companies or old media companies, which are sort of New York based, what we call as traditional media. And now I think we are seeing a sort of a new ecosystem evolve. These are new tech publications. They might be on podcasts, and then they'll have YouTube channels. So I think this conversation will be very interesting. We'll talk about all that things. And also, what is the model for a new tech publication in the larger media ecosystem? Where does that fit? Traditional media versus new media, how do we define those things? And in general, like what are the storytelling trends and tips and things that are happening in tech startups and the venture capital world? So if this is the first time coming to Startup Project, don't forget to subscribe to us wherever you to listen to us or on Substack.
Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's fun.
So I think you worked a while at Forbes. Forbes is this has this interesting cultural context, whether it's in tech or in general, broadly in the world of business. What was it like, day to day working at Forbes?
It was honestly a great place to build a career. When I first joined, it was a long time ago. I had just spent a couple of years covering startups in New York City for another magazine, Fortune. And I joined Forbes actually as the homepage editor back when people cared a lot about homepages. And I got to kind of, cover startup interests that were not super well covered by my mostly West Coast team. So being in New York back then, ad tech was a big area that I downloaded. I got to write about some early companies like ZocDoc, Blue Apron, General Assembly, and of course WeWork. I wrote the first story about WeWork. And I'd say, first off, Forbes was valuable to me because especially early in my career, there was a high concentration of talent. The Forbes alumni network, whether they're new creators, like Laura Shin is an amazing crypto entrepreneur and reporter. She was at Forbes. There are folks across the ecosystem who were journalists there at some point. And learning from that high concentration of talent, especially in the office, was super valuable. It was also great to have editors and people kind of really helping me figure out the craft. And then more recently, I would say it was a great platform to just meet amazing entrepreneurs and write about the ecosystem, whether it was, Melanie Perkins at Canva or the Collisons at Stripe. I'd say Forbes was certainly a great door opener to get to, meet with some of the most exciting people in tech.
What do you think, where does Forbes fit in like today's tech media publications? You have Forbes, Fortunes, the OGs like New York Times and Washington Post of the world. But then there is a new broader tech coverage ecosystem. I feel like, there's Kara Swisher who does Pivot, and then there is, I think Casey Newton who does the Platformer and who also collaborates on Hard Fork. I think there's sort of like interesting mix on the both ends. Like, where do you see Forbes fit in that sort of ecosystem?
Yeah, so at a high level, especially now with upstarts, I see that we're sort of new media, and Forbes and some of those other places are traditional media or trad media. But I'd say, broadly speaking, there are kind of three main groups that I think are relevant right now. There's the legacy traditional media folks like a Forbes, the New York Times, or others. There's the new media like me, like Eric Newcomer, Alex Heath, Emily Sundberg in sort of the business side of things with her Substack Feed Me, that whole sort of Substack or Beehive ecosystem, and also journalists who do podcasts and shows. And then I think there's the really good sort of non-journalistic content creators. And that could be, TBPN. It could be some of these VC-led podcasts or your podcasts, Jor Kesh. Like there's amazing people, who I'd say are not journalists but make good content. So I'd put Forbes on sort of one end and then, that on the other, and Upstarts is in the middle. Then within Forbes, I'd say what's interesting is Forbes, the Wall Street Journal, CNBC, Bloomberg, they kind of write for a general business person. And so they can go deep on technology. Like Forbes just hired an AI reporter who's really good from Reuters. They have continued to do good tech coverage even without me there anymore. But at the same time, I don't think they're writing so much for the tech insider crowd. They're writing to explain tech to a wider business person. And I think, if you look at the New York Times or the Washington Post or some of these other publications, they're even farther removed from the tech insider. They're trying to explain why should we know about OpenAI to people who are maybe skeptical about reading about OpenAI. And I think, then of course, like the new media folks are much more plugged in, writing for a different audience. So I don't think that there's a hot take like Forbes is dead or old, traditional media has no future. But I think it maybe writes for a different audience and it kind of fills a different niche than where a lot of maybe your audience or the people I talk to currently sit.
Yeah, I think it makes sense because I think everyone has their own place because you, even though like the individual smaller companies can do interesting things, I think there are certain things the bigger companies can only do. Like, you cannot spend 2 months on a project collecting facts and, doing a deeply investigative story, even in tech. But like, that's not really possible for me, for sure. I don't consider myself any sort of like a journalist or anything, but even for you who I'm assuming you guys consider yourself as, this middle, you certainly bring that sort of journalistic aspect to tech startups, and you can do those stories, but not at a scale where a Forbes or a Fortune or a Bloomberg can do. So I
Yeah,
think,
I would say a big difference is like I consider myself at Forbes like a big game hunter kind of, where like you do that big cover story on the Collistons or something, and then you could kind of like reset for a week or two, figure out what you want to do next, kind of like, you know, lick your wounds. Whereas now that I'm still a journalist, but I'm also a startup founder, it's like I'm doing a sprint and a marathon every day. It's like you go from this to back to business development, back to working on the next project. So I have a lot more empathy with founders now because I understand that challenge for sure.
yeah, let's talk a little bit about like the part of new publication, right? Like what what does the new tech publication in 2025 constitute? Is it is being on Substack? Is it being on YouTube? Is it being on, having a podcast? Or is it, having an event business? I think it seems like all together, and you have to start somewhere and expand into all these different directions to actually build a business. Is that a fair statement?
I think it's totally fair. We saw in the sort of traditional media landscape that I grew up in, there were these seismic shifts that would be very disruptive to the newsrooms, to how we consume the content, whether it was the infamous pivot to video, which happened a couple times. There's a moment where all these news publications were being told, make videos for Facebook. Then it was make videos for TikTok or Snapchat. And I think, it's always been a real danger when media companies orient their whole energy towards one medium or one style of storytelling. And so I think what you see with new media players like me and Upstarts is we're trying to kind of have multiple touch points from the get-go. So from day one, Upstarts, for example, we're 8 months in. I've hosted over a dozen events. I have a really good conversion of free subscribers to paid subscribers who are also supporting my work. And then I have sponsors who present the free edition of my newsletter on a 1 or 2 month basis as well. So kind of 3 revenue streams right out of the gate so that I'm not overly beholden or risk on with one of them, if that makes sense.
So how much content are you putting out like on a weekly basis? Is it like two Substacks or two stories, two startups that you're featuring and then have a conversation and an event? Like how does a new publication like think about its own, like how much content to be putting out there? Because there's so much content and, consistently, like it's almost like feeding a beast. You're falling into this, treadmill where you have to continuously run now. I think that's the difference between like being your own publication versus working at a company, right? Like now you have to
Yeah,
consistently feed the beast.
it's relentless. It really is. I think this is true for any content creators or people who are trying to build a brand today. Even if you're, let's say, a founder or a growth marketer who's watching this, like if you're trying to build an audience on LinkedIn or X, like you have to be posting all the time, right? And I think you're right that it's the same with a media brand, just even more so. So for me, I've published every week since we launched. We publish 2 to 3 times a week. And every week I try to have a launch or an exclusive about an exciting kind of earlier stage startup, either coming out of stealth or raising its first big funding round or sharing its revenue for the first time, kind of like a news moment where I can share about the founders, about the technology with the world. So earlier this week, I had one of these on a drone startup. Next week, I'm writing about a really interesting expert network attempts using AI, trying to kind of jump around so it's not all the same topic every week. And then we also have a paid edition where I do more trend stories or deep dives or Q&As with founders that are maybe off a news cycle. I also have published some scoops about, you know, juicier, exciting things that we heard about that didn't want to be announced yet. And all of that would go to my paid subscribers who pay less than the cost of a New York City sandwich right now a month. Sandwiches have gotten way too expensive, but that's another conversation. But for less than one of those, you can support and get all of that work. And I try to publish once or twice a week there. When we launch our own podcast next year, hopefully in January, that's going to be even more work for me to be doing the podcast episode and hopefully 2 articles every week. It's going to be a lot of content. I'm going to be very much in founder mode, just grinding to get all of that done.
Who are the people who are doing this well in this particular category? And I can give some of my names on my own, but I'd love to get your thoughts on like what are the practices they're doing and who's it doing that's really well that you admire in terms of how to follow their tips and tricks on how they're doing content in this space.
Yeah, well, I would say, I have a couple of friends who are VCs who I think have really good podcasts, and I've definitely learned from them. Turner Novak is a good friend of mine, and I love his Peel podcasts. Jack Altman, with his show, does a great job too, kind of founder turned VC. I also am friendly with the guys at TBPN, and I think from a live news standpoint, I've learned a lot from them, and I think their big insight has been to create potential viral moments by kind of having fun clips from each of their guests, and I think that's something I take to heart. And then on the sort of Substack or newsletter side, one of my friends, Eric Newcomer, went independent from Bloomberg 4 years ago. And Newcomer has grown to have writers, employees. They have a huge event in San Francisco once or twice a year called Cerebral Valley. And I think he publicly shared a year recap recently where he said they'll do 3 million in revenue this year. So that was really impressive. I admire that. I would love us to get to 3 million in revenue, even faster than 4 years. We'll see if I can pull that off. But I learn a little bit from each of these different types of folks, whether it's on the podcast side or the newsletter side. I've also really admired, I mentioned before, but there's a writer named Emily Sundberg who has a publication called Feed Me, which is about sort of the intersection of culture and business. She's built an amazing audience where she sells out merchandise and like has fans who like come up and want to take selfies with her. Kind of like the Acquired guys have an audience like that too. And I really admire how all those folks have built a community, that's really rooting for them. And I hope that Upstarts, we can do that over time too.
I think, Newcomer built a really good. I've heard and followed Newcomer's work, and briefly met him when I was thinking of incubating an event series in Seattle, and he was generous with his time to share like how he built his event series and the way he approached and some of the tactics that involved. I think for Acquired guys, the added benefit for them, their structure is they're completely dependent on their own time. They produce actually the fewest number of content in all the creators you mentioned. If you look at like how many episodes or how many posts,
But
Upwork
on a
actually
per minute or per hour basis, they still do a lot of work because those shows are really long, right?
yeah,
It's
yeah,
like three
they're long, but
hours.
on the output
Yeah.
basis, it's smaller. So it tells you that if you can stick for the long term, you can approach it in sort of different ways. But I also feel like all this category of creators, whether it's newcomer or you or Casey Newton, I think you guys are all anchored on an existing brand, and that brand had helped you in terms of gaining some minimum traction early on, and then you have sort of compounded on that. But it's really tough now to actually, if you're coming up with a blank slate, to build something, it'll take much longer. Like newcomer might have taken 4 years. For someone without working at Bloomberg, I think that would be maybe 8 years or maybe 10 years to get to the same stage. I think that
I
anchor
think you're
effect
right.
is very important.
No, I think you're completely right. When I think about sort of people who have gone from scratch, on the VC side, like Molly O'Shea with Sorcery, which is a newsletter and podcast, she's kind of started from no brand and built a really meaningful brand where she gets to partner with Brex and have big speakers on, like an Alfred Lin from Sequoia, et cetera. Nicole Wishoff is another VC who's been really aggressive in building a brand. I was excited to go on her podcast recently. But on the journalist side, I think many journalists don't have the network or the brand to be able to go independent. And this is definitely a challenge where I think you're completely right that if you spend a lot of time building a community, building a name for yourself, this is an okay path to take. But I don't think that like every reporter at Forbes could go independent today and be successful. It's unfortunately a lot maybe like trying to make money making TikToks. Like I think we've seen a lot of data that most creators on YouTube and TikTok don't really make a lot of money, right?
Yeah. And it's a lot of survivorship bias, right? I think the conversion rate on like how many people actually make money on YouTube is actually ridiculous. I think it's more unequal than the real life. Like yeah,
It's the power law. I mean, for people in startups, we all hear about the power law, right? And it's like
yeah.
I think in the creator economy, and I think kind of in the journalistic side that I'm doing, it's really hard to be in the middle. It's like either like you are the elite or you are a challenger. I'm dealing with this candidly still right now, where if I'm pitching sponsors on Upstarts, our newsletter is growing every week, but it's much smaller than like Lenny Rachitsky, who's built an amazing brand, right? And so if you're comparing just raw audiences, I'm never gonna compare, at least for a long time, to Lenny. And so I have to hope that Upstarts is bringing some different value, a different kind of reason to partner with me than just the size. Because on a power law size game, like Lenny is an order, he's in a whole different stratosphere, right?
In terms of like talking about pure distribution, right? I mean, obviously you're writing the content, and you're soon, I'm assuming, launching a podcast. Um, how is the distribute? How are you thinking about distribution? Because I feel like over time you have to post in many places, but you have to find one distribution channel that really works for you, and where you
Mhm.
can, where somehow you've convinced the algorithm that your content is worth amplifying, right? So that it's all about convincing the algorithm at this point. So which sort of distribution channels are working? Which distribution channels are not working? What has been your experience like?
I think from a social standpoint, LinkedIn and X continue to be good channels for me because, as you kind of noted, I already had audiences there of tens of thousands of subscribers or followers. So they've both been pretty good channels, but it's been very hard to build new channels. Like Threads and Blue Sky are not major sources for me. ChatGPT is a top 10 referrer to my site, which is kind of interesting. I think I should lean in more or figure out how to make sure that Upstarts is being surfaced when appropriate in Perplexity, in Claude, in ChatGPT. And then I think from like, there's a Substack recommendation engine that's gotten me a bunch of subscribers. I think I could do better to engage more with my peers on Substack, whether it's collaborating or commenting, just kind of being part of the conversation there. Because I think, the reality is there aren't a lot of equivalents to like YouTube's recommendation engine, where like at least theoretically YouTube is like, you will get into the long tail of other people's videos and you can build an audience passively. I feel like my experience has been that you have to build an audience very actively. Like if I don't share my work, as you said, relentlessly, it doesn't get noticed. So
Yeah. I think, yeah, it's sort of like um, people who got early on Twitter have an extremely good advantage. I think, at least my personal experience has been actually the Twitter algorithm deteriorated massively, and it doesn't actually has um, any kind of sort of like elevation for the new accounts at all. And I think you have to say basically some kind of extreme opinion, take an extreme opinion on some sort of an issue, and that's how you basically now get Twitter views. And so I've been really disappointed in terms of like what Twitter algorithm has become. I mean, I
I
know you
think
don't
it's very hard. It's very hard to build. I think you're right. I think my engagement is better than it used to be. I think like Nikita Bayer, the new head of product, has improved some things because I feel like I got even less engagement a year or two ago. But I agree that it feels to me like the era of hypergrowth and like a total meritocracy of building followings on Twitter is over. It was in the past. I think that's one thing I think about with Substack and as we launch on YouTube as well is like if those are also kind of saturated markets, how do I just keep getting in front of people? Because there is a cold start problem, I think, everywhere. We're just in a very fractured information economy right now.
Yeah, and I think the algorithm is actually basically is done at this point on X, and this might be a little bit controversial to say. And I think the good times or like the peak usage of X is also behind it today. And I think the
Mhm.
next, my personal experience has been Threads is where people are going to move, because Blue Sky, I think it's still a smaller, it's not gaining like beyond certain level. I think Threads is the only one that's gaining wider traction. I see everyone who's
What kind
post.
of personas do you interact with mostly on Threads? Or like, do you see certain communities have really moved to Threads? Or like,
Yes, I think
what has
I've
resonated? Yeah.
so I actively use Twitter for because I post constantly and try to make
Hmm.
sure my videos get posted on Twitter and also Threads.
Hmm.
So I definitely see that everyone who I follow on Twitter is now actively hedging their strategy on Threads. So and they're sort of gaining traction. And I'm not being really good at posting on Threads, and I've just started looking at when that statistic about Threads being one of the Threads increasing their usage has come out. And once that came out, I thought, okay, what is happening on Threads? And I started, engaging more there. And I've seen that everyone who has a bigger following, and I'm only talking about like the tech and VC space. I'm not talking about like, any
Hmm.
other politics or comedy, but I'm generally like the same people are, because my timeline over the decade has been perfected towards technology, AI, and VC sort of space. And all the big accounts are actually posting on Threads. I think only a very small percentage is not actually posting exclusively on Twitter and not on Threads.
That's
So
really
everyone
interesting.
everyone started hedging their bets with Threads, and which is actually a sign that so Blue Sky is losing, Threads is winning, and I think Threads has the potential to be that sort of like OG Twitter algorithm, where
But that's, honestly, it's kind of annoying for me to hear that because if I already have audiences on X and on LinkedIn, what
yeah,
that basically tells me is I need to be investing even more time in a third channel, right?
yeah,
And I think that is a problem for people like me who already have limited bandwidth, like that we have
yeah,
to basically, as you noted, post in all these places. Like when I publish an article and it goes out to my newsletter subscribers, they at least get it automatically. But then I have to spend like, sometimes up to 2 hours just promoting and sharing the work everywhere
yeah,
else, right? And it does feel like a chore to kind of go down the checklist of like, here's my asset for LinkedIn, here's my thread for X, and now I guess
yeah.
I should be doing more thread posts as well.
Yeah, and I think that's where I'm hoping some of the AI tools are actually helping out. I think you can, because I'm an individual creator, I'm not actually monetizing or thinking about monetizing, but I want to experiment with as many channels as possible and compound the effect as much as possible. And I think AI is helping that do that better. Pre-AI, I would have probably stopped the podcast because I can't, like, I don't have enough bandwidth to do all the stuff necessary to get the podcast out, even though like I have some editor, working on it, but I still have to do a bunch of work before and after the process. And what I've learned is like there are AI tools. I can see it happening soon where I don't have to spend so much time, and I've reduced drastically the amount of time I spend on whether researching a guest or generating assets after the conversation. I think I've drastically reduced that time, and I think we're seeing more of the tools sort of like going to give us that. Uh, you know, it allows more independent creators to monetize their original work. I think we will see that soon happen. I think there are some tools that are getting really good at doing that. And I'm hoping that in the next 1 year, it should compound the effect. And I don't have to worry about posting on Twitter and Threads. I just post something and then it goes everywhere.
Yeah, I'm really excited for that because I think, one kind of irony is that I've been doing this long enough that I played with those tools before generative AI when they were just kind of like automation flows and
Yeah.
they weren't quite there. It actually would create more work than not. And
Yeah.
so I'm someone who's kind of like been burned by that before. So I'd be less likely to be excited to be an early adopter now. But if there is a perfect experience where I just write a post and an agent shares it correctly across the platforms, of course I'll adopt that
Yeah.
once it's like fully worked out. So
Yeah. I think the difference this time is um, AI can adapt to different personas. And I think the products are not yet there, even though the capabilities are there. So actually, it's more about finding the right abstraction and how to create the new buffer or the new tooling that actually makes sense. Because it has to be at a level where as an individual, I can modify the flow. It shouldn't be like one way to do things. And that was the problem with the SaaS era of products, that there's only one way you try to force fit into that model of scheduling, or like I post here and then it goes there. But I think there's a level of personalization you can bring using AI that was not possible before. So even though what we used to call as workflows or automations are extremely more powerful when you add AI primitives in it. So I think that's where the magic is, and I'm seeing the hint of magic, and I can talk about it. Post the call, and I can show you some tools that are actually working. But I also wanted to ask you about, one of the most biggest conversations in VC Twitter is Midas List, and I think you are the closest person I've talked to who worked on. So tell me about like the Midas List, like how seriously people take it. We see a lot of controversy when the list comes out. Is it a quantitative list or a quantitative list? How should we actually look at it? And what are VCs telling about what Midas List off the Twitter?
yeah, totally. So I ran the Midas list for 10 years. So I obviously wouldn't have done that if I thought it was like a worthless project. But we did work hard to like make it better while I was working on it. And I think number one is it was 100% meant to be quantitative as much as possible. So one big difference from a couple of the lists that we've seen try to compete with it is there's no opt-out mechanism for Midas. If the model thinks you should be on the list, we would have put you on the list, whether you like it or not. And that created a fairness, I think, that was really important. Well, we also wouldn't remove someone just because they said they didn't like Forbes, they didn't like Midas. So it was never about playing favorites. And I think that was a really important thing. um, we'd have people claim there were politics involved, and we could always say, well, look, if you're a left-wing VC, there are other left-wing VCs here. If you're a Trump supporting VC, there are other Trump supporting VCs on there. It happened after I left, but David Sachs, who's involved with the current administration, he made the list last year. So it's non-political, no favorites being played. It is a mathematical model. And then the question was, how could we always make the model better and better? So the Midas list has been around for 20 years. It predated me, and it obviously will continue long after I left Forbes. And I think the value of that is you do have many years of historical data. And so they have data every year on over 100 firms, thousands of partners, and they can use that to triangulate missing gaps, or if there are discrepancies with people trying to rewrite history. That is a very valuable proprietary data set. And I think people, people may not see that because you're not going to share your proprietary data with the entire world. But like, you know, that if we think about in the era of AI, like, you know, ChatGPT, Claude, all these places, you know, the models keep getting better. Where's their value? If you're like training your own model on your own proprietary data, Forbes kind of has that similar thing with its database of VC information. They also partnered with a fund of funds called TrueBridge, which I think was a smart move. It happened before my time, but they continue to work with them since. And TrueBridge brought in a bunch of firms and like, you know, credibility to share that data. Then once a lot of firms are sharing, it's a lot easier to go to a big firm like an Excel or, you know, Index or whoever and say, well, your peers are submitting data and we just, you know, the more data we have, the more accurate the model is. So please submit. And it's always confidential. Like I wouldn't be looking at it as a reporter. So I think that all really helped. But you know, it's an imperfect model. I think the biggest challenge that I always felt was that it's a multi-stage list. And so you have seed investors, you have growth investors, you have 1,000 or 10,000x small check, and then you have a 10x or 5x huge check.
Yeah.
And so we were kind of like, how can we make a formula that reflects bigger and bolder bets that both rewards the huge multiple early stage VC and the huge cash return late stage VC? So we tried things like you know, modifiers or weights, and we would experiment a lot to try to kind of have multiple ways to win on Midas. But I think a reflection of the limitation with that was that while I was still at Forbes, we launched the Midas seed list as like a auxiliary list for just seed investors, because the model just like couldn't fully reconcile seed investors as easily with those big growth investors. So all of that is to say, I think, you know, the Midas list is done very thoughtfully and mathematically, and it has a real moat that is hard to crack. You know, every year or two, you'll see someone try to do a competitor, and I think they find that it's just like 100 times harder than it looks.
Yeah, I think, I mean, everyone has their own sort of big list that make, right? Like Time has Time 100, Fortune has Fortune 500, Forbes has Midas List 30 under 30, right? Which also has a little bit of a meme and, you know, 30 under 30 to
Well,
pipeline.
30 under 30 is a fascinating question because I think the biggest frustration with that one was, you know, high downside risk if someone ends up not being as great as you think versus disproportionate to all the great people you have on, right? So
Yeah.
so if someone has raised, let's say, $100 million in the ecosystem, everyone thinks they're amazing, like they have all this momentum. Of course, they're going to make lists, right? They're going to be able to raise from the best firms. Like everybody will celebrate that person. Like let's not forget that Sequoia had a big glossy interview with Sam Bankman-Fried on their website until FTX went under, right? And so if the whole industry is celebrating someone, it makes sense that they would make a list like that. And then I think the challenge for Forbes is they become a meme as you're associated with like a few of those people, even when statistically it's, you know, most of the people on the list are great people that you and I don't really even know, but they're just like solid people. You know what I mean?
I mean, the younger you go on age bracket, the riskier the list is, because you don't have reputation to go off of. So it's sort of like that is built into the structure of the list, because you're judging people. It's just like startups, right? You're judging a person or a founder before he has proven. So it's bound that 40% of your portfolio is going to go zero. The same thing with the list, because the list is also like all young people who have not proven.
There's also a funny factor where the most successful people have so much going on for them that people don't talk about them as 30 under 30. Like LeBron James or Sam Altman or Taylor Swift, they were all 30 under 30s.
Yeah.
But people don't associate that, right? Because they have much bigger things to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, even like when Sequoia announced change in leadership the other day, and people are talking about how Roloff didn't have, like, some of his bets went to zero. Like, yeah, that's part of the deal. In anyone's portfolio, you'll see that you know, there will be some zeros. But yeah, that's sort of like the nature of the business for VCs. Anyways, are there any potential niches? Because I feel like the newcomer has a niche. He has built like the Cerebral Valley AI, and I think he sort of like found an interesting corner in that VC space. I think Alex is doing big technology podcasts, and he has sort of like more focus on, talking to big tech and covering AI on big tech is a lot of focus. And you are doing, featuring new startups, talking about new upcoming things and doing exclusives on that. Are there any niches, like TVBN came up with a live format? I think the format itself is a niche in which they've innovated. It's sort of like, I would say, they saw CNBC's Squawk Box and what if we just do startups or tech? I think that's basically how I look at TPB, and it's basically CNBC Squawk Box, which goes on for like, I don't know, 3 hours or 4 hours every morning, and basically take that and do, because they are also live every day, all working days, and you do that for startups and big tech, and that's what TPBN becomes. And the naming is also, I think, similar, 4 letters or 4 characters. Are there any other niches or interesting ways you can approach or like create new things in the space?
Yeah, well, I think you're right. There's either like the platform or format unlock, or there's the content unlock. I think, so far with Upstarts, we've been trying to be the trustworthy and fun publication for startup coverage that we felt the market was not providing. So what I mean by that is in-depth original reporting that is not usually hard paywalled. Like every week our launch stories are fully free and they're over 1,000 words and they're in depth. And like, I don't think you're getting that from a lot of other places where you're getting like real reporting with a bunch of phone calls, tough questions as needed. You're getting like detail, and you're also not getting like a crazy expensive paywall. Like you might see where we see people post on social media the screenshot of the headline because no one's gonna like pay for the story. And so I think Upstarts is trying to fill a niche in between where it's like we can bring that curated, awesome storytelling to startups before they're obvious and everyone's trying to have them on their podcast.
Yeah. I think,
Can we pause for 1 sec?
sure.
It's my lighting has gotten dark. Can I turn the light on really quick?
Yeah,
Will that be okay? All right,
yeah,
one
yeah.
sec.
Robert.
Okay, let me just. All right, much better.
Yeah. We will light it up again. Um,
Okay, cool. Well,
we'll use AI.
sweet.
Um, so I have one more question. What is grabbing your attention in AI? I think I would have not done the podcast, kept going if like AI didn't come across. Because I felt like technology was becoming boring. I think just talking about another startup and output of that startup was really getting boring for me. But I think, what are some interesting things that are capturing your attention in AI?
Well, I think one thing that's been really fun for me is to kind of go through different workflows or like job functions where I feel like AI is a no-brainer benefit, and kind of look at who are the startup players who are helping in that category. So a good example is I wrote about Crosby, which is like an AI-enabled law firm, where basically Cursor is a fast-growing company, but it only has 2 lawyers in the whole company. And so they can only make that work if they have contracts being redlined initially partly by AI. And then also what's cool is AI allows them to go to a project-based pay cycle where rather than lawyers charging by the hour, they can charge on a per contract basis and be much more aligned with creating value in that way. So I've also looked at a company that does this automating IT tickets. I've looked at, a company that's trying to just recently try to do your contact list, like basically figure out who you should be keeping in touch with as maybe a better personal CRM. Like, I feel like there's just a bunch of annoying workflows that I maybe even wrote about a startup 10 years ago that was like trying to tackle this, but the technical problem was just too challenging without generative AI. And I think that's where I've been really excited to see like actual magical experiences, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so I've tried to kind of always find new companies like that. Like the drone company I wrote about recently, they can use AI to basically just like scan a video camera feed and tell you if like the truck that's there is the gardener's truck or a suspicious truck, and flag it for a human security guard if it doesn't, if it looks suspicious. That's much cheaper than having a human manually watching the video feed 24/7, right? So it's been, I think, these real world workflow like automations that improve people's lives and don't seem to like obviously just like be a fun toy to play with. Like that's where I've had a lot of fun. I'm curious if that resonates with you at all.
Yeah, I think the most exciting thing is, I think, yeah, when I first started working in tech, the mobile era has already been done. So the
Mhm.
Ubers and Airbnb almost like invented, and everyone is using it. We sort of like started in that era. And
Mhm.
then, AR, VR was a big thing, which I think will eventually be it, but the hardware was not yet there. And then
Mhm.
came crypto, and I think big tech now was never actually big on crypto in some sense. So I've
Mhm.
been working with big tech for a while. Although like there are small incubated projects and
There
Meta.
was like a moment, right? Remember, like Facebook was like going to get into
Yeah,
crypto for a
I think
bit,
that's the
but you're
only
right
big.
that they didn't stick with it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the only big crypto project that I could remember, which I think is what we are seeing with stable coins as a use case. It's basically, some a version of that, right?
Hmm.
So other than, betting, uh, I couldn't see it as like a horizontal fundamental shift. It's more of like you have a new type of database with that, you could do some interesting things on currency, and we haven't seen like real different applications, even with like developing things on Ethereum, and those things felt a little bit off of like you can do a lot more things. There were only like maybe 5 use cases I could think of,
Hmm.
and it felt like it was the number of possible use cases versus number of things I could develop as a developer when I see it are not there yet. I was not getting enough ideas just organically to do with it. But when AI came, I mean, I see anyone um, who I meet is like, if you don't have any visa restrictions or any of those restrictions, you should not be working anywhere but in an AI company, because every generation has their moment of interesting waves that happen, and like some people realize, oh, this is a wave that we should hang on to and move quickly, and they get benefited, if not in their first company, but on the second company. I think I keep telling everyone I meet that you should just go and work at an AI company, or like move to a team inside your company where you're doing something with AI, or you're using AI to create new and interesting products. Like, the new thing book, Michael Lewis wrote, like that's sort of
Yeah.
true in some sense, right? So for me, I think it was definitely like all in on AI. I think,
You know what
yeah.
this reminds me of? I wrote a cover story years ago about the CEO who is retired now but took Snowflake public, Frank Slootman. He's one of the
Mm,
great leaders in tech history. He did 3 IPOs. And one of the things he told me back then that I've never forgotten is he said the secret to his career was that he just always figured out where the engine room was in the business or the organization he worked at. And he wanted to be as close to the engine room as possible, powering the business, really driving the innovation. And he was like, you're always going to find growth opportunities if you're by the engine room.
yeah.
And I think with like your advice to go to AI companies, I feel like it's very similar. Like you want to be close to where the innovation is. You want to be close to the engine room of this ecosystem. So it
Yeah.
really
And
resonates
even
with
if,
me.
if the company or the product fails, the experience will add so much benefit to your resume anyways. I think that's always like you can hedge the downside by saying that will the experience actually elevate my professional experience over long term? And I think any company that you work for right now, which is like fast moving and really has a good product, I think you'll benefit from either from the start or like from just the experience of it as anyways. So I think we're almost at the end of our conversation. One final thing I want to ask you is, when you're at Forbes, you get a lot of inbound. I think the
Hmm.
Forbes tag actually helps you get open dates, right? But now you're trying to feature new companies, new startups. How do you approach this problem of like, no, you don't have that Forbes name, but you want more inbounds to come to you? I know that you have certain cachet in the industry already, but like, how do you like build up pipeline?
The best way is word of mouth. Like it is a lot like leaving a big brand. Like, one of my friends was a leader at Stripe and now has a new startup, and same challenge where it's like, yeah, the Stripe brand can help you a bit, but you have to rebuild your word of mouth. And I think the thing that's most gratifying is when I write about a founder and they introduce me to more founders. So like we wrote a story about Austin, the CEO of Unify, which is a cool AI tool. And that came from another founder referral. And then Austin has referred several of his friends to me for potential coverage. And so to me, he's like now a Upstart connector. And I think that's really important to me that startup readers, founders, like they tell me who I should be writing about next, and that can be really good. I think where I lose the Forbes brand the most, or where I feel it, is talking to the really big names in the world. You know, like I was honored to go to Microsoft in my career and do a cover interview with Satya from Microsoft's offices when I was at Forbes. I think it'll be a while before Satya talks to upstarts, but I hope that I can re-earn that trust or that interest by just doing a lot of good work. And so for me, it's like with the new founders, it's just about getting in front of their friends, getting into their referral network. And then with I think the really exciting leaders in the tech ecosystem, it's about upstarts kind of eventually earning its right at the table again, where then they're like, oh, I remember Alex when he was from Forbes years ago. Cool to see his new brand, because I guarantee you a lot of these, like especially public company CEOs have still never heard of us. They might vaguely remember my name, but they've never heard of upstarts. And so that's just gonna be a lot of hard work to kind of fight my way back. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. This was a great conversation. Thank you, Alex, for coming on the show. And once you launch your podcast, maybe we'll do another episode, about the podcast itself, and talk.
We'll have
more.
to have you on the Upstart show too. I'm so excited to have more ways to collaborate with people moving forward. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.